Joe Letteri, Senior Visual Effects Supervisor on Avatar, The Way of Water. You and your team really reinvented the wheel with the first Avatar. And I know James Cameron held a summit 13 years ago to talk about the sequels and what you guys can do better. So
Mhm.
what did you guys discuss during that summit?
The biggest part of it, since we didn't really know what the story was more about the process. Like on the first film, Jim really had this idea that he wanted to be able to do the digital part of the movie and the film part of the movie in the same way, which is why we came up with this idea of, using a virtual camera. And so that Jim could actually shoot his actors on the performance capture stage and see them, in situ in the world of Pandora, at least a very low as representation of that. And what that means practically is he's kind of pre-building the whole film in that virtual world. So there's a lot of data that needs to come back to us to get the final shots as close to what he is laying down that blueprint for, which we called a template. So the early discussion was really, like highly technical. It was about building out that pipeline. Later on, once we knew what the story was, the discussions became more about how are we going to achieve the specific effects that we need? Water obviously being a big one, but characters, a lot more characters with speaking parts in this film, a lot more varieties of characters, old, new, young, different species. So what we were doing kind of evolved. But yeah, overall, we have not stopped working on it since that postmortem. But the actual final like push on the film when, Jim started doing the performance capture and we started getting like heavily involved with the specifics of this film was about 5 years ago. So we've been working on it, pretty heavily.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting because I know you guys came up with so many new tools during the process. So even when you started working 5 years ago, there's like stuff now that you could have used back then, right? Like when you
Well,
first, yeah.
yes, and we were also, anticipating it. Like on the first film, if you know anything about CG lighting, up until that point, it's a lot of like point lights, very localized light sources. It's kind of like lighting on a stage. That film was all about, being outdoors, and that kind of lighting wouldn't work. So we adapted this technique called spherical harmonic lighting that had been primarily introduced for games to do that global illumination. But after completing that film, we realized that wasn't going to be enough. So we decided to write our own path tracer, which is the renderer that makes the final images. And that development went through, like we tested it on the Hobbit films, we tested it on the Apes films. Like it's something that we've been building up to what we were going to need for this film just because we knew it was coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that iterative process. Like I know you, having worked on Alita, Battle Angel, used that to pioneer the new facial animation technology.
Well,
Right.
not quite. Alita was the end of the old facial system.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, we realized that for the fidelity we needed and for the number of characters, the way we had been doing it wasn't going to suffice. When I say the old facial system, it's the technique we first developed to do Gollum, and we had been, for Lord of the Rings, and we'd been carrying that through. But for this film, we wrote an entirely new facial system based on a neural network that could understand the relationship between muscles and skin and what you're seeing on the face. And that became the animation tool that we used for the facial system. We would capture the actors with a stereo camera rig and pull information from that, feed it to this network to understand what the muscles were doing, and use that to drive, the characters. And then on top of that, the animators had access to the exact same set of muscles. It was a much more intuitive way of working than we had before. And so they would do the final polish and anything that needed to be done to put it together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it just really makes it so much more emotionally truthful when you could see like the muscles, like the intimate details in their face when they're speaking or just moving or smiling. Yeah.
Exactly. With the old system, it was really hard to avoid kind of moments where it would look rubbery. You'd have to catch them and, by eye and really just try to iron them out, but your tools were limited. This system is much more true to how a human face actually works. So it gave the animators a lot more, kind of direct control on making that performance come through, because as much as you're capturing the actor's performance, but you're putting on a new character. So there's always a bit of interpretation that we have to do so that emotionally you feel the same way when you're watching the final performance as you do when you're watching the actors give the performance. And that's always our goal, is to maintain that emotional connection, because really the main characters of this story are all CG characters, right? So that drama is something that we always look to carry through.
Mm-hmm. And I know you also developed something to create more realistic hair. Is that right?
Yeah, hair again is just one of those things that is, kind of tricky to get right. And so, yeah, we wrote new tools for that as well. And especially because we had the characters spend so much of the time in the water, like traditionally we've all built tools like this to get characters running or flying or doing things in the wind. But, when you're in the water, your hair is floating differently. When you dive in the water, it's subject to different forces. When a character comes out of the water and you've got all that water like draining off their hair and back into the ocean, those are the kinds of things that we spent a lot of time on, writing new tools and really trying to get that believability. Water's tricky because you have things like droplets coming off of hair, dropping into an ocean that is, hundreds of kilometers across for what you might see visually. And so it's getting all those scales to work together required a whole new suite of tools that we wrote just to deal with water.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's in the title, so.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, the internet lost its mind over a clip of, Jake Sully tying the strap. And like he's sitting on the surface of the water, and people were like, "Oh my God, was that real, or how much was that CG?" And it was a mix.
So that was a mix, but the one of Jake tying the strap was real. Like that was an actor, with blue makeup. Like Jim really wanted to do that, to get that detail right. But everything around it, like from the arms up, like say from the wrist up, we had to put that and attach it to the CG character. We had to split in the water line with what was shot real. There was a lot of handwork to make that happen. Plus, we're shooting everything in native stereo. So that makes the work a little, less forgiving. And so, yeah, we had to deal with all those factors. But, the idea that Jim had is like you have these moments of reality mingled in throughout, and it really forces you to lock down the realism. Like there's no shortcuts that you can take, because it has to, it all has to match. Like one of the things that was different in this film than the first film is we had a human character, which is, Spider, the kid, in a lot of the shots that would otherwise have been all CG. And again, that forces you to lock everything down from what, Russell Carpenter was doing when he shot those and did the lighting for it, to what we had to do to integrate it. Because again, that's all, there's a lot of blue screen for his elements, but that's all shot in native stereo as well. So, integrating all that is part of what makes it work.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just filming underwater in general, I know you guys, there were 2 tanks, right, that you worked with?
Yeah, there were 2 tanks. So there was a performance capture tank that was done, for the shots of the Na'vi, the Metcalina, which are the village people, when they're diving in the water, when they're swimming around, anything they're doing underwater, we captured in that tank. Then when we were shooting live action, there was another tank, and that was used primarily for the shots of Spider in the water, because a lot of that, was live action. And then we would put the 2 together, because when Jim was doing the performance capture takes early on with the virtual camera, he had Spider in there, Jack, who played him, was in there. And so he played all those moves with the characters live. And then when it came to shoot his part, whether it was, in a set or on a tank, he had already been through it. So he kind of had one of the best rehearsal sessions that you can imagine, for pulling that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, this movie also has some new creatures, the tulkun, the ilu, the skimwing, right? So what went into designing those because they resemble some of real world creatures like whales and dolphins, but they're
Yes.
not them
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. I think anytime you're doing creature design, you want those touchstones of, does an audience recognize something similar? Like on the first film, we had like the dire horses, which were basically horses, but with 6 legs, right? So you try to create some familiarity while at the same time you're bringing something new to it. So, that was mostly Dylan Cole, who was one of the production designers, designing those creatures, but obviously side by side with Jim, because Jim is a fantastic like artist in his own right. He will draw exactly what he wants, and that's what it has to look like, when you're done with it. But then, we would pick it up like with Dylan, with Richie Bainham, Dan Barrett, our animation team, because every character is defined by motion. The look only gets you so far because it's never static. Is it going to move believably? Is it going to propel itself believably? What does it look like from all different angles? And like, especially with the tulkun, because there's so many shots, specifically with Payakan, who was the one that, Loak befriends. He's giant. He's much bigger than a whale, but Loak is sitting next to him and they're kind of conversing. And he's only got an eye in frame because that's all he could fit in frame. So we had to do a lot of animation with just that eye to get the bonding, to get moments where they were connecting, moments where there was fear, any of that. So I think our animators enjoyed working with that because it's very minimal. So you really have to, like nudge
Yeah,
everything
and in
to
the same way,
do it.
how like the performance capture, you want it to be emotionally truthful, and now you're able to with the new technology. I think even with these creatures you're creating yourselves, like I was fully invested in Payakan because I was like, I care so much about this creature, and it's
Yeah.
it feels like it feels real because it's just a testament to what you guys did with him.
Well, thank you. But you know what? It's also a testament to the story. I think sometimes Jim doesn't get enough credit for this, but like a lot of that is in the writing. It's like you feel that emotion because he takes us through that whole story progression and builds up to it, and you understand how it's going. I mean, you've got Loak, who's the teenager, the number 2 son trying to find his place, and always screwing up. And you've got this other outcast, Payakan, who has screwed up big time. They naturally form a bond together. It's like those things we're all familiar with, so the visual effects allows us to tell the story in a different way. Like, I'm sure we've all seen stories with that kind of thing in it before, but not in this way. And that's the thing that I really like about doing visual effects, is that you can open up, your eyes and hopefully an audience's eyes to something that they may be quite familiar with, but allow everyone to see it in a new way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of eyes, I don't know, like when you're watching the movies, I don't know if like it registers to people that like Navi are really tall. And I know like
Mhm.
Sigourney Weaver's now she's a teenager, Curie. She's supposed to be
Yes.
like 7 feet tall, right?
Yes.
So,
Mhm.
how did you guys? I know you guys like did something different with the eye line in terms of how you shot it when she was in scenes with other characters. So what did that entail?
Okay, this is when we're shooting live action, right? If we're shooting on the performance capture stage, they're playing to each other, and if the heights are different, like Sigourney's actually fairly tall, but if she's supposed to be like 2 foot smaller than say Jake, we adjust that eye line afterwards. That's like a pure animation thing. We adjust it as part of the body and facial performance. When we were shooting live, though, and this was primarily for shots with Spider in it, because we had captured everything beforehand and knew what the performances would be. Jim wanted something more sophisticated than running around with tennis balls. He wanted it to be much more accurate and much more performance driven. So what we had on set was an eyeline system, a cable camera that we just pulled the tops off of each of the sets and ran this cable camera around. And the cable camera had a video monitor hanging off of it. And it had on that monitor the performances for whoever he was playing against. If it was a shot with Quaritch, it would have Stephen Lang's performance. If it was with Curie, it would have Sigourney Weaver's performance. And this, because again, Jack had like played all that as himself on the performance capture stage, he'd been through it all. So this gave us accurate eye line which was great because, again, we were shooting native stereo. That really helped because we didn't have to do those normal kinds of adjustments that you usually have to do to compensate for the tennis ball not being in the right place. So it gave us a lot performance-wise that was really helpful.
That's awesome. Well, lastly, where are you guys at with the sequels?
We are started. We are underway. Yeah. As usual, we hope that we would have been starting, earlier to get a little heads up on it. But everyone who's worked in visual effects knows, like, deadline is the deadline, and you throw everything you can to get it on screen when the movie comes out. So we always have the best of intentions of overlapping, but it never works out that way.
And there'll definitely be new advancements by the time 3 comes out.
Probably because, like Jim was saying a couple of weeks ago, it's like, okay, well, I think we finally know how to make this movie. And it's like, okay, let's apply that to the next one. Yeah.
Well, Joe, it's great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,
And
Joyce.
you get to stay on because
Okay.
we'll come back now.
All right.